The Forest Park Feed Ground is one of 22 state feed grounds managed by the Wyoming Game and Fish. Through litigation, multiple radical green groups are attempting to hijack the authority and management of the Wyoming Game and Fish and ultimately shut down feed grounds like these, which would in turn reduce our elk populations. This could have a negative impact on every Wyoming resident. I'm here with the president of the Professional Outfitters of America and Wyoming Outfitter Guides Association, Cy Gilliland. He has over 4 decades in the hunting and outfitting industry and is a true advocate for sportsmen and conservationists alike. So, Cy, elsewhere in the country you don't see in these feed grounds, but yet in Wyoming we have them. Why is that?
Well, early in Wyoming's history, when this country first started being settled, the ranchers would settle their property in what would be a likely spot to build a house, have hay fields, that sort of thing, and it filled in and took away winter range from the wintering elk herds.
Okay.
So they'd come out of their summer range, their fall range, to go to where they traditionally went before this country was settled, and they'd end up hitting and commingling and interfering with livestock. So the earliest example of that was in Jackson Hole in the early 1900s when Jackson Hole was first settled. They had some tremendous problems, a couple hard winters where an incredible number of elk starved. They got into the ranchers' haystacks and they had huge problems. So they came up with a system of, okay, the elk are going to be here, they're going to come over here, we're going to feed them, and we're going to keep elk from starving to death, and we're going to protect our livestock and our hay supplies from and share them with the elk, but we're going to put it over here and we're going to keep them out of our fields and out of our haystacks. So it was, we have unlimited supplies of summer and fall range for the elk in this part of the world, but we have an incredibly limited supply of winter range. And so if we want to have the kind of populations of elk that we have to provide artificial feed for them in the winter to keep their populations from starving to death so that we could continue to enjoy elk to hunt and for wildlife viewing.
So you mentioned the one in Jackson, that's the National Elk Refuge, but then there's also state feed grounds. What's the difference between the two of them?
So there's the National Elk Refuge in Jackson is the one everybody thinks of. It's on the Refuge system, so it's managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's part of the federal refuge system, which there's wildlife refuges all across North America, all across America, and that's one of their cornerstone ones. And so it's on a different land status than the state feed grounds. The state feed grounds, there's 22 of those. Most of them are on National Forest Service lands. Some of them are on state lands, some of them are on private property, but most of them are on National Forest Service lands. So the National Elk Refuge is set aside, it's forever protected, it's its own entity. These ones operate off of a permit system. Like the one we're at today, Forest Park, it has a permit that is authorized by the Bridger-Teton National Forest, and it's currently up for reauthorization. And that's why it's one of the feed grounds that's been picked out for this lawsuit.
Cy, can you walk us through the process of when the elk are being fed and what the feed is itself, and then who's involved in that process?
Okay, so there's a little bit of difference. In the National Elk Refuge has kind of a parameters. They've got a lot of natural feed there. So a number of years ago, when the feeding system was really being analyzed, they created a sprinkler system. They started growing a lot of winter habitat on the National Elk Refuge. Mm-hmm. So they'll make the elk rely on that until it's covered up, and then they'll start feeding them supplemental feed. They feed pellets up there. They're certified weed-free pellet, and so they'll take that out with heavy machinery and drop that in a pellet form. So the state feed grounds are a little bit different. None of them feed pellets. They all feed hay either in large bales or in small hand-sized bales, depending on how the feeder is going to do it. So the Wyoming Game and Fish operates the 22 state feed grounds. It's all certified weed-free hay, so we're not bringing invasive weeds into the Forest Service. And then It's bought from local producers in western Wyoming. The Game and Fish hires contract feeders. Those contract feeders work once the natural feed is covered up by the winter snows. The Game and Fish says, all right, today we start feeding at this particular feed ground. The elk can't get to natural vegetation, so they start the feeding process there. And it'll continue on until the elk winter breaks. It's kind of interesting because when you talk to the feeders that feed on these various feed grounds, the elk kind of just leave. And so once their natural vegetation opens back up again, winter breaks, you could put all the feed out there you want and they won't come to it. They just go back to their natural, once it's available, their natural feed.
Interesting. How many elk would you say are getting fed like a feed ground like this?
Okay, so this particular feed ground fed around 460 elk last year. Through the whole state feed ground system, their numbers are averaging around 15,000 elk per winter on the 22 state feed grounds. And the National Elk Refuge is currently feeding about 7,500 elk. The pre-wolf, there used to be 17, 18, 20,000 head elk would come to that National Elk Refuge. Obviously that prey base or that elk herd has been knocked down because of predation by wolves and then grizzly bears in the spring. And so it's about 7,500 animals. So you add those two together, it runs, Wyoming's statewide population is about 113,000 animals statewide. So about 20% of our entire state population is dependent upon winter supplemental feed, which is a huge number.
So it's creating quite a few jobs and things like that, good for the economy as well, would you say?
Yeah, you have it's fingers all through the economy. So you've got the producers that are growing the hay, you've got the people that are contract feeders working to have jobs to feed the elk, and then in addition to the tourism industry that relies upon having a vibrant, large, flourishing elk population, which provides income to the hunting and outfitting industry, and then all the resident and local sportsmen and the non-residents come in to enjoy our hunting resource, and the amount of money and economic development that they spread through these communities in western Wyoming is really quite huge.
I'd say. So if you're a contract feeder and we're taking hay and we're getting it out to the, how does it get there? Can you tell them about that process? Because it's really quite fascinating.
Yeah, this particular feed ground is fed by teams of horses and a wagon. So the feeder will load the wagon up each morning, 60 to 90 bales, sometimes in 20 below temperatures, and they'll hook up a team of horses to it. They'll take that team of horses out, get them lined out on a nice straight line, and then they start dropping the hay one bale at a time to the elk. And then when they get to the end of the feed line, they'll get back on the wagon, control that team of horses, turn around, get them headed back the other way, and then go back and start dropping the hay. Some of the state feed grounds are fed mechanically. They'll have equipment that loads it up, loads it on the trailer, pulls the trailer out, then they drop those large bales of hay, and they'll start dropping it off to feed to them. So it just depends on the logistics of that particular area. Some areas don't lend themselves well to mechanical feeding, and some areas do.
So within the last couple of years, chronic wasting disease, or CWD, has been kind of at the forefront of sportsmen's minds. Is there any kind of play-in as far as having a feed ground and the disease transmission?
That's a really good question, and it's a huge unknown. So Wyoming, like a lot of western states and a lot of states in Canada, elsewhere, are dealing with the CWD issue. We just recently completed a statewide task force with multiple stakeholders on how to deal with the CWD issue in Wyoming. And of course, feed grounds is a big part of that. So CWD resides primarily in eastern Wyoming, but it is marching across the state. It is becoming a slow movement anywhere there's ungulates and cervids, which basically are elk, deer, and moose. So in eastern Wyoming, we have this incredible endemic area around Sublette Canyon. It's kind of where it all started in Wyoming's our CWD problem. And in that area, the whitetail and the mule deer are heavily infected. They run 40-50%. But the elk herd, which is one of Wyoming's premier elk herds in that Laramie Peak area, it only runs a 3 to 7% infection rate, whereas it's significantly lower than the mule deer and the whitetail. And nobody really knows the answer to that as to why that is, because elk are they're very gregarious. They love to be in large groups. That's what they do. They do that in areas where there are no feed grounds. So the behavior that they exhibit on a feed ground where there's 300, 400, 500 animals feeding together, it's exactly what they do in free-ranging elk that do not have any feed grounds at all. So those elk in eastern Wyoming, you'll see them in herds of 1,500, 2,000 animals all the time, wintering together all the time. But yet the transmission rate's incredibly low. So one of the issues has always been around the feed ground issue has been disease, and it started with brucellosis. So the brucellosis issue was real. It causes cattle to abort. It's one of the reasons why we feed these elk, to keep them away from domestic livestock, so that we don't have disease transmission of brucellosis to these cattle herds. Which what happens when that takes place is oftentimes the entire herd of cattle have to be destroyed so Wyoming can maintain its brucellosis-free status, which is a big deal economically and to our producers. So once that kind of phased out, Wyoming did a test and slaughter program. They, on several of their feed grounds, they would catch, or they'd have built these big test facilities. They run the elk in there, they bleed them, they test them for brucellosis titers. If they came up positive, they destroy them, use the meat because the meat's edible. It doesn't affect, what's really strange about brucellosis, it doesn't cause elk to abort their calves, but it does livestock. So anyway, that was a big thing. It was a huge hue and cry. The anti-groups, these real radical groups, that was their original platform to stop feeding, was brucellosis, and it's phased out and nobody really talks about it much anymore. So now they've shifted their focus to CWD, that if we continue to feed elk, we're going to have this huge transmission of CWD on these feed grounds. And in reality, nobody can stop CWD. It's going to do what it's going to do. There's no vaccine for it. There's just no hope on the horizon at all to get this disease under control, stopped. It's going to do what it's going to do. And there's just so many unknowns about it. So we do know for a fact, if we stop feeding these elk in western Wyoming, they are for sure going to die. We're going to lose 80% of this elk herd all across western Wyoming. That's a fact. But we don't know if CWD gets over here, are we going to see the same results of only a 3 to 7% infection rate?
So, Cy, if people wanted to get involved and have a positive impact against this fight, against these radical green groups who are trying to destroy such a wonderful resource, how can they get involved?
We need your help. To be involved, to help us out on this, we need a financial donation to help deflect the costs of what these two lawsuits are going to cost the outfitters and guides that are leading this battle right now, leading this fight. Also, you can help by joining Safari Club International. They're First for Hunters. It's a great organization. They've been here since the beginning of this battle, and they'll be here with us all the way to the end. So the two ways to help is a financial donation and to join Safari Club.